Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. And our third segment of the day here is going to be concerning some injury updates and ensuing fantasy implications for this week of the fantasy football season. Now, not many big ones to really be concerned about this week. A lot of kind of minor injuries, and not necessarily injuries that would really impact the depth of your fantasy football squad, but still some things to monitor. But also, we're going to be talking about a more positive aspect of injuries, if you can call it that. The return of certain players to certain squads that could really help you in your push for a fantasy playoff spot this season. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about the minor injuries that were sustained just this past week before we get into more overarching injuries and potential return for certain players. Let's talk about Drake May first and foremost, because this one I'm not necessarily too worried about. Jerod Mayo said that he was practicing yesterday. He practiced yesterday in a limited role. He still is in concussion protocol, but that gives me optimism that he could potentially start this week against, I believe, let me just check their schedule, but he should be able to start in this game against the Titans. And, I feel like the reason why this one could be a little bit more impactful, should he not start compared to if he does, because of the production he's been getting out of very underrated, undervalued receivers in the fantasy market. Keishon Butte has been great with him. Demario Douglas has been good with him. Ramondre Stevenson in the backfield has looked a little bit more rejuvenated these past couple of weeks. So I feel like if this Drake May injury does extend for a couple of weeks, maybe because of the fact that, concussion protocol is very interesting to come back from, I still think that, this Patriots offense could be fine. And if Jacoby Brissett has to play this game, so be it. But once he comes back, he's still going to be effective, and all his guys are going to be productive again. So that's why I feel like this one is so interesting, because out of all these quarterbacks who are more concerning in terms of injuries, Drake May is one that you forget about because of the way he's elevated this Pats roster. Now let's get into a much more pressing kind of injury here. Maybe not as pressing as we once thought when it happened, but still one of note as the Packers go into one of their most challenging games this season. Jordan Love with a groin injury. Now, a lot of people were saying that he looked like he was ready to go back into play last week after he sustained it, but this one could be very cautionary. And not for nothing, Malik Willis is serviceable enough to run this offense, again, if he's asked to come into duty against the Lions. But then again, it is the Lions. So the concern is, do you start Malik Willis and risk it all in a game that you feel is one of your most important to date? Or do you try and bring back Jordan Love and have him risking getting more injured than he already is? But at the end of the day, the decision stems down to the effectiveness of both of them. If it's Jordan Love, then you know that he can effectively run this offense. He's looked like one of the best QBs in the NFL since his return from that earlier injury. But if it's Malik Willis, you're going to have to play it a little bit more safe. But both ways, ironically, could work for the Packers in this one. Because if you control the football, that keeps the offense off the field. And that could suggest that potentially the Packers will be fine with starting Malik Willis. But if you really want to turn this game into a shootout, that projects more towards Love. So it's really about how the game plan plans out for Packers here. Because chances are you want to start Jordan Love in this game. And it looks like he can. But if you feel he's not going to be as effective in this one, then you might want to play it safe, because who knows? Keeping the ball might be the difference in this game for the Packers. And so that's why this injury is so weird. But also it's weird because of the fact that it eliminates some of the production you can get from guys like Kraft, guys like Reed in this offense, should it be Malik Willis who starts. So that's why I feel like this one's a really interesting fantasy conundrum to try and figure out here. Because we're going to get the news sooner or later about whether or not he will start. And if he doesn't, then that could be an interesting concern to try and figure out if you're a fantasy football manager who owns Packers receivers or running backs. Let's get into one of the more unusual injuries of these past couple of weeks with the whole DK Metcalf situation. Now, this injury seems very vague, and as I said before, I feel like I'm someone who follows teams or is a fan of teams who don't really know how to present injury information well. They're very tight-lipped about certain things that happen in the organization, especially with the injuries, and this one feels the same way for Seattle and DK Metcalf because we know it's an MCL sprain, but we don't necessarily know the timeline, and it's week to week. McDonald said he was optimistic that potentially he could play this weekend, but this does come at an interesting time for Seattle because they're playing a very important divisional game this weekend against the Rams, but then they're on a bye. And then you get into the more challenging part of their schedule. So it's going to be interesting to see if McDonald holds DK out, risks potentially losing this game, but gets him back after the bye, gets a couple more players back after the bye, and we see a new and improved Seattle. Or you start DK Metcalf, try and win this game, try and take the lead in this jumbled NFC West, and then rest him up for the bye so that he can be even better for the stretch run. So that one's interesting just because we know so little about the severity of this injury and whether or not it could be re-aggravated should he play this weekend. But it's still one to monitor because of the fact he's been very productive this season from a fantasy perspective. So that's why I feel like that one's also very pressing in terms of what Seattle might need and how they might use him in these coming weeks. And then let's get into the injury that just broke and could be very prescient in tonight's game. Stefon Diggs. Now, I feel like, once Nico Collins comes back, this receiver core will be just fine. Because it was just fine without Stefon Diggs last year when it was Collins, Brown, and Dell. But in this game, it's certainly going to be missing. I feel like a receiver combination of Tank Dell, Robert Woods, and Xavier Hutchinson isn't going to create much separation for C.J. Stroud. And if you remember, last year, in this very game, C.J. Stroud looked the most mortal he'd looked to that point in his rookie season. So this is going to be a very challenging game for the Texans. So if you have a guy like Tank Dell in your roster, who potentially took a flyer on one of their tier 2 receivers or wide receiver 2s, then good luck to you tonight because it's going to be a very uphill climb for this receiver core. But it gives them an opportunity to grow. Guys like Woods, who we always know can be reliable where he's playing as one of those third down options in situational moments. And Xavier Hutchinson, first real time we see him as a rookie out of Iowa State. But he could be somewhat exciting. I've seen him before watching the Big 12, and he looks like a very exciting project for them. So this could be an interesting situation where, yes, you're kind of ruining the injury to Stefon Diggs if you own him, but also the unique opportunity to open up new avenues for your receiving core as well. So that's why, this injury to me feels more like an opportunity unlocked for the depth of this Texans receiving room to make it even more versatile than it is kind of a woe is me moment. Because a lot of the time in fantasy, you can never predict season-ending injuries, especially this late in the season. But you have to take them with a grain of salt, and you have to accept them eventually, because if you don't, then you're not looking at the glass half full here. You're trying to account for too many things, and you get caught up in an injury when you could be surveying your other options here. The Texans now have a lot of options, especially now that Nico Collins could come back, and that will help this Texans receiver room. But for the time being, Just work with what you have. And so that's why this injury to me isn't as detrimental from a fantasy perspective as it is in real life. So that's why I'm a little bit optimistic about the outlook of what guys like Woods and Hutchinson can bring, because we know that Texans wide receivers will always get unique opportunities to succeed. Now let's talk about the positive aspects of these injury updates here. The guys who could return. Let's start with Christian McCaffrey, obviously, because a lot of fantasy owners are still PO'd that he did not start the season out for them if they picked him number 1 overall. I feel like the plan for them is that he will sit out. Actually, they're on the bye week, so he won't have to sit out as a starting game. But when the bye week is over, he will come back for their Week 10 game against the Buccaneers. That, is an opportunity to actually see what he can mean down the stretch for the 49ers. Because my thing is that the 49ers without him have been mostly okay, but he does add a different dimension that you have to account for when he's in there and healthy for the Niners that they don't really have. I think the main problem for them has been in the red zone. The efficiency there has plummeted without him, and neither of the running backs can figure out how to score in that area. They're very good in open space, both Mason and Garendo, but I don't necessarily know if they can be as physical, as explosive, as dynamic in the red zone as Christian McCaffrey is. That's not, to their fault, but it is something to monitor once he comes back because of the fact he's so important what they do and can actually open up a lot more than just the run game for this 49ers squad. So we're going to have to see once he comes back. If he does, next 2 weeks' time against the Bucs, then we'll have to see. And then let's talk about TJ Hawkinson, who could make a return as soon as Sunday night against the Colts. We'll talk about that game in the last segment. But that should be a very exciting news for Minnesota Vikings fans, especially for Sam Darnold as well, because he hasn't really had an option over the middle. He's really tried to work the perimeter too often, try to get the ball to his perimeter threats in Jefferson and Addison. But now that he has a big tight end who is physical at the catch point, can challenge backers, I feel like that just diversifies this Vikings offense a lot more. It just makes it that much more potent. Yes, it could lead to the detriment of, Jefferson, Addison, Jones owners even, but you have to understand how important guys are from an offensive perspective. TJ Hawkinson changed the game for the Vikings, I feel like. And so you can't necessarily count him out when you have to consider the depth of this Vikings team from a fantasy perspective. But let me know what you think in the comments, because I feel like injuries, they'll come and go, and you can either be on top of them or try and play them out. But this segment is just to keep updated with them throughout the week. But coming up next, I make my picks of the week for the biggest games of Week 9 in the NFL. We'll be right back after this short break. Don't go anywhere.